angels, they are out of sight, helping me through the fight. Aiming for remedy, I hit the target that I couldn't see. Oh, tenderness and gravity activates my grateful heart. You color me outside the lines. My angels, they are out of sight. The tree bark fell for me to see that a thicker skin can chip and leave. You color me outside the lines, my angels, they are out of sight. The tree bark fell for me to see that a thicker skin can chip and leave. You color me outside the lines, my angels, they are out of sight.
Introduce our speaker. Nick is the co-founder and CEO of Clay Imports, a direct-to-consumer e-commerce company here in Austin. They also have a creative studio in Mexico, and they specialize in designing, producing, and selling handcrafted tiles, home goods, and clay architectural products. As an experienced tile installer himself, Nick has established strong relationships with skilled tile artisans and manufacturers in Mexico. Alongside sourcing and developing fine clay products, Nick often collaborates with artists from various mediums to bring fresh products to an international design-oriented market. That's us. In addition to the great work he does at his company, Nick also serves on the executive board of Mexic Arte and serves as the chair of the Austin Salido Sister Cities Committee. He also founded the Mezcal Moto Rally 3-day motorcycle race. Clearly, he is way cooler than me. As a guest lecturer, Nick has also educated students at UT and Texas State University. Here to share his thoughts on the intersection of creativity and pattern, please help me welcome Nick to our Creative Morning stage.
I don't do a lot of public speaking for obvious reasons. Most people understand. But yeah, public speaking can be terrifying. But I found that this topic is it's one of my greatest passions. And I was incredibly nervous coming in here. But then I saw a little bit of that presidential debate last night, and I thought, yeah, the country's completely fucked. But I'm going to be completely fine tomorrow because no matter what I say or do, it's going to be so much better than that. Yeah. I couldn't have had a better act to follow. Yeah, so y'all are here right now. We're going to have a conversation about patterns, or the intersection, as Brian was saying, the intersection of creativity and patterns. And of course, this is a huge topic. You know, patterns, they go so often overlooked. They're involved in so many different industries, from visual to audio, software development. Patterns are incredibly complex. I have like 15 minutes to talk about it, so I'm going to focus on, or narrow it down specifically to three categories related to patterns. And these are the three things that I do every day. And those three things are, so firstly, it's the creation of patterns. As Brian said, I work at Clay Imports. I have a couple of jobs at Clay Imports, and one of my jobs is I'm on the product development team. We have a very talented team that spends their days just thinking about patterns to make that people might find aesthetically pleasing and want to incorporate into their homes or everyday lives. So yeah, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the creation of patterns. Creation of patterns. Then the second thing I'm going to talk about is the way that I use patterns that I've created to increase the value of products. So the second is creating using the created pattern to add value to a tangible thing. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about is the sustainability of maintaining that connection between either yourself and that pattern that you've created, or your business and the pattern that you are benefiting from. So maintaining the sustainability of that association between you and the thing you created, your intellectual property. Those are the three things that we're going to review. Going to the first one, the creation of patterns. Yeah, this one is really fascinating. If y'all don't mind, I'm gonna I'm feeling so incredibly inspired by Malik. I'm just going to sit here on this. Yeah. Yeah, so the first one is the creation of patterns. And this is something that there's patterns all around us every day. Patterns are increasingly being used because the ability to apply patterns to various mediums, it becomes easier all the time. So oftentimes patterns almost become invisible. We just overlook them. They're so incorporated into everything that we're doing. But those patterns all came from somewhere. Patterns are almost always going to be a human designed thing. Very rarely do we see repetition of a visual aesthetic in anything organic or natural. So creation of patterns, I and my team at Clay Imports, we have 3 ways that we create patterns. This is a picture of me, and I used to be a tile installer in Austin for a long time. And this is me installing tile in Austin. This is actually how I became interested in patterns. When I was a tile installer, I was working with a lot of really talented people like architects and designers, and they were always standing right over my shoulder saying, no, don't do it like that, do it like this. And I started to understand why it was so important that it was done a specific way. And that's because the patterns are always trying to relay some type of significance, whether it's an emotional or sending a message of some sort. So if the pattern is not patterned correctly, then that feeling is interrupted. So anyway, that's where this started. Before Clay Imports, which is a retail store, e-com store, I was an installer and I worked with patterns daily. These are just some pictures of some old installations that I used to do. Like these are Austin, 20, 25 years ago. Anyway, so, oh yeah, this is a really interesting one. So I'm still on the first thing, which is the creation of the patterns. I worked with tile for like 20 years before I ever even considered creating my own pattern or being involved in the creation of a pattern. This is a specific project, though, that was a kind of a key moment in my life, I guess. Like with many industries or occupations, you can be really good at something and experienced and do it over and over again. But as long as you're following instructions and not doing your own thing, you're going to be kind of creatively limited. That's why this project was so important. This was the first job that I ever went to when somebody told me, we kind of want this aesthetic, and these are kind of the patterns we want to use, but do whatever you want. We've seen your work before, so do anything you want. And this house was huge. That was the first time I had, I think, real creative freedom to kind of do whatever I wanted. And that was so incredibly inspiring, and this is the actual project that led to me really believing that I can create patterns. So anyway, this customer, I just want to, and I owe this person so much. And speaking of the people standing over my shoulder constantly telling me how to do it right, this person kind of did that, but he wasn't telling me how to install tile. He was just talking about his life and his business. And I was there for like a year installing tile in this huge house, just by myself and one other guy. It was incredibly impactful. It was a very significant year. And it's what led me to not only feel confident that I could create my own patterns and sell them, but also that I could start an e-commerce business. Yeah, so this guy, anyway, this was I'll say his name. His name is Steve, and he created a product called the Fleshlight. And so for a year, he was just telling me about, he's like, yeah, you put stuff on a website, and then you ship it from a warehouse. And so that was, that was like iPhone just came out, Anyway, now that we're talking about creating patterns, there's 3 paths that I take now. In these early days of like installing stuff in some creative way, that's a lot of fun, but there was so little structure to it. It was very art and emotion based, which is a lot of fun. But it's hard to, that's not super reliable. So the reliable paths that I found for creating patterns were, number 1, just find somebody else that already has a pattern and then kind of collaborate with them and then take their pattern from whatever medium it is that they're currently applying it to and apply it to my products, tile. So that's number 1. And I refer to that as the original collaboration path. Original collaboration path. Find somebody else, they are already doing it, and work with them and incorporate their patterns into your mediums. And this is Sade. she is actually, she's a pattern designer from New York, and I met her, and my team and I invited her to our design studio in Mexico, in San Miguel de Allende, and we modified the patterns slightly so that they would easily apply to our medium, which is ceramic tile. And these are actually the patterns that are by the front door. When you came in, they're on the table, and y'all are welcome to take those. Those are tiles that have been converted into trivets. They have cork on the back of them. And anyway, but importantly, the pattern that's applied to all of those tiles, this is Sade's. These are her original creations. So again, creating patterns, path number one is just find somebody else that's already doing it, work with them. Maybe you modify the pattern slightly, but you're still dealing with an original pattern, something that is really created within your mind and this person that you're collaborating with. Path number two is called minimal change. So again, number one was collaborating with somebody who's already doing it. Number two is called minimal change. So whenever you're dealing with patterns or working with patterns, and again, in my specific example, this is like a commercial application. I'm selling patterns that people are aesthetically pleased with. So my path number two for creating patterns is find a pattern that's already successful. So we have data at our company, and we know which patterns sell more than others. So very often we'll take the most popular patterns basically, and after they start to get kind of repetitive, no pun intended, but after the pattern starts to get too repetitive or overused, we just freshen it up. So we'll take that popular pattern and just tweak it, like modify it, like 5 or 10%, maximum 10%, until we come up with something that looks fresh, but also familiar to people. So they feel safe and comfortable with it, but it's also something new that they've never seen before. That's path number two. That's the way, number two that I make patterns. And then number three way that I make patterns, this is called the Mexico inspiration, or just environment inspiration, really. Yeah, as Brian mentioned earlier, Clay Imports, which is an Austin-based company, and a lot of history in Austin. Our design studio is in Mexico, in the state of Guanajuato. By the way, Guanajuato is a state in central Mexico, and there are 31 states in Mexico. If nothing else sticks with anyone today, there's 31 states in Mexico. My team and I, we spend a lot of time in Guanajuato, Mexico, in central Mexico, and we're incredibly inspired by our environment, as most people really are. But very often, that inspiration, it can fade away if you don't document it. So we're constantly feeling inspired by things that we see in our environment, in my case, Mexico, and we're documenting them as often as possible, like pictures or drawings, turning those pictures and drawings into digital patterns that maybe we'll store them, indefinitely, or maybe next month we turn them into the new tile. This picture right here is just an example of that. This is just a pair of boots, and the patterns are everywhere, the inspiration. This is a pair of boots with a pattern on it that's now being turned into a tile. But it's everywhere. It's like every little thing we look at. If we're in the bar, the little pattern from the 1950s jukebox, or like the wood carvings on the backrest of chairs, all of those things. So these are just some examples of pictures where we find inspiration for these patterns. Yeah. Anyway, so those are the ways that Clay Imports and myself and our product development team, that's how we create structure around creating patterns. Because without that structure, it's crazy to just kind of like sit down, and I've done this before, just sit at a table with a notepad and a pen and try to come up with a new pattern. It's incredibly frustrating. But identifying these three paths and then trying to stick with one of them from start to finish until you come up with a pattern makes it incredibly manageable, almost to the point where you can schedule it out. Anyway, so that's how we create patterns. Clay Imports has a goal. We sell tile. Most of our tile has patterns on it, and those patterns are not arbitrary or from nowhere. Our goal is for every pattern that we sell to be something that we designed either with one of our collaborating artists, through our inspirations, or through our evolutions of our existing patterns. All right, next thing. Oh, yeah, this is a really interesting one. People always get a little more interested when we start talking about money, but using patterns to create some type of a perceived value on a tangible thing. So our tiles are ceramic, and if you saw them coming in, you're very dazzled by the pattern and the color. but the body of the tile, everything around the pattern, all of the other variables, whether it's the packaging, the clay, the marketing, the sales team that's promoting them, the website that the tiles are on, all of the other surrounding variables are the same. They're the same. You have to fire it in a kiln at the same temperature, whether it's a pattern or no pattern or different patterns. All the variables around the tangible thing don't change. So what changes is the pattern. And somehow, if we're able to apply a certain pattern to an already existing tangible thing that already has some established industry value, then somehow we increase the value of that thing exponentially. It's fascinating. So the creation of patterns not only allows us to deliver messages and create emotions, but it really does give us the ability to take an existing tangible thing that has an established value and just make it more valuable. And of course, I'm talking about the application of patterns on ceramic tiles right now, but I think that we all see this very often in the case of textiles, for example. Adding a specific pattern to it, especially if that pattern has some association to something that we consider cool, interesting, or valuable, then it's way more expensive than the other thing that uses the exact same amount of resources. I found that so fascinating. And it took me like 20 years to really understand that. And then the other thing is the sustainability. Oh God, this is kind of a controversial one, I think, a little. This has to do with ownership, intellectual property and ownership. So creating a pattern, in a sense, that's intellectual property. You have used your intellect to create something that is valuable. But then verifying that ownership is a really interesting, challenging process, frustrating. Verifying that ownership is really tough. And then what's even harder is maintaining the association between you and the thing that you created. Maintaining that association is not only challenging, but I think it's impossible. And I think that's why so many of the patterns that we see in the world every day now, we don't think about where they came from because it doesn't matter. We don't associate them to a thing or a person. But my experience with this specifically, and again, I'm talking about the creation, the ownership, right? Like creating this perception that you own the thing and then maintaining that ownership. And we're talking about a non-tangible thing, like just a doodle. So this is the controversy. I thought for a long time, okay, it's important. I made that pattern, it's mine. And if somebody else uses it, they're wrong. And a lot of people still maintain this. And I understand that completely because, that's like a lot of people's livelihoods. Like this woman, Sade, the artist that I'm working with, who has all these amazing patterns on display at the entrance. That's like her full-time occupation. She doesn't have a textile or a tile that she sells. She just creates patterns and she relies on the income from the intellectual property that she's created. So I understand the need to protect your resource. But I have also, through my experience, I don't want to do that. I don't know if anybody has gone through the obstacles of trying to register intellectual property, but it's incredibly challenging and it involves so many things that are not only not creative, but just stressful and frustrating and make my life unpleasant. And then once you even get beyond that, the whole protection thing where somebody else uses it and then you want to try to protect it and the whole hiring a lawyer and then cease and desist. And those are just things that I have experienced and they do not, they don't make my quality of life better. So I personally have very little interest at this point in trying to maintain the connection or the ownership. If somebody else takes it, fine. I really rely on, and I feel good about, just constantly creating, constantly working with different creative people, exposing myself to the inspirations that lead to pattern creation. Yeah, and that's how I want to spend my time, is going through these processes and having the output be a beautiful aesthetic pattern that other people find so pleasing that they want to pay money for it and put it in their house. Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on.
Yeah.
We all have the ability to forward the patterns that we love and that add value to our lives, and we have the power to create new patterns together. Thank you, Nick. That was fabulous.